One careless second can change the entire direction of a life. The sound echoed through the ballroom before I even realized what had happened. A sharp crack. Then silence. Complete, terrifying silence. Every conversation stopped. Every head turned. Every pair of eyes locked onto me. My hands froze in midair as a broken piece of porcelain slipped from my fingers and landed on the polished marble floor. I stared down at the shattered fragments scattered beneath the crystal chandeliers of the Sterling Foundation Gala. My stomach dropped. Around me, hundreds of guests stood perfectly still. Wealthy donors, business leaders, art collectors, socialites, people who probably spent more on watches than I earned in a year. And in the center of their attention stood me, Olivia Bennett, assistant curator. Accidental disaster. I swallowed hard and looked at the display pedestal beside me. Empty. The priceless artifact that had occupied it only seconds earlier now existed in several unfortunate pieces across the floor. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear anything else. Oh my God! The words escaped before I could stop them. A woman nearby covered her mouth. Someone whispered. Another guest stepped backward as if distance might somehow protect them from my mistake. I wanted to disappear. The evening had started so differently. My museum supervisor had invited me to attend the charity gala, because several historic pieces from our institution were being exhibited during the event. It was supposed to be a networking opportunity, an exciting night, a chance to meet important people. Instead, I was standing in the middle of what felt like the most expensive mistake in American history. Security personnel began moving toward the display. My legs felt weak. Then I heard another whisper. That belonged to Alexander Sterling. The name moved through the crowd like a sudden gust of wind. Alexander Sterling. Even I knew who he was. Billionaire CEO. Business genius. Media mystery. One of the youngest men ever to build a Fortune 500 company. People described him as brilliant, ruthless, and impossible to impress. Not exactly the type of person whose treasured possessions should be broken. The room remained unnaturally quiet. Then the crowd shifted. Instinctively. Respectfully. Almost fearfully. Someone was approaching. I looked up. For a moment, everything else seemed to disappear. Alexander Sterling moved through the ballroom with calm, measured confidence. Tall. Impeccably dressed. Completely composed. His dark suit looked as though it belonged in a magazine. The expression on his face revealed absolutely nothing. That somehow made it worse. The crowd parted automatically to let him pass. Nobody spoke. Nobody interfered. He stopped a few feet away from the shattered artifact. His gaze dropped briefly toward the floor, then lifted toward me. My pulse doubled instantly. I opened my mouth, closed it, opened it again. I am so sorry. The apology sounded embarrassingly small. Alexander said nothing. His eyes remained fixed on me. Not angry. Not emotional. Just observant. Studying me. The silence stretched so long that it became unbearable. Finally, I forced myself to continue. It was an accident. I was backing away from another guest and I did not see the pedestal. I will pay for the damage. The second the words left my mouth, several nearby guests exchanged looks. One man actually laughed under his breath. That was when reality hit me. Whatever this artifact was worth, I probably could not afford 1% of it. Heat rushed into my face. Alexander glanced once more at the broken pieces, then back at me. His expression remained unreadable. You cannot. His voice was calm, deep, controlled. My stomach sank even further. Of course I could not. Then something unexpected happened. Alexander took a slow step closer. The ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Miss Bennett, he said quietly. I blinked. He knew my name. Before I could process that fact, he delivered a sentence that made absolutely no sense. Tomorrow morning, I would like you to come to my office. The room erupted into whispers. And suddenly I was far more frightened than when the artifact broke. Fear is a strange thing. Sometimes it arrives like a storm. Other times it follows you home and sits quietly beside you all night. I barely slept after the gala. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shattered porcelain scattered across the marble floor. I saw the shocked faces. I heard the whispers. Most of all, I saw Alexander Sterling looking directly at me with those unreadable gray eyes. By 6 in the morning, I gave up on sleep entirely. My apartment in Brooklyn suddenly felt much smaller than usual. I stood beside the kitchen counter staring at a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. My phone buzzed. It was my supervisor, Margaret. I already knew why she was calling. "Olivia," she said the second I answered. "Tell me you did not actually break the Sterling artifact." I closed my eyes. Unfortunately, I did. Silence. Then a long sigh. "Do you have any idea how important that piece was?" "Apparently not enough." Margaret laughed despite herself. "The board is already talking about it." My stomach tightened. Am I fired? Not yet. The fact that she said not yet did not exactly make me feel better. By 8:30, I was standing in front of Sterling Tower. The building seemed less like an office and more like a monument to power. Glass and steel rose high above Manhattan. Employees moved through the lobby with purpose. Everyone looked confident, successful, expensive. Meanwhile, I felt like someone walking toward her own execution. The receptionist greeted me immediately. "Miss Bennett." I blinked. "Yes. Mr. Sterling is expecting you." Of course he was. Somehow that made everything worse. A private elevator carried me upward. My reflection stared back from the mirrored walls. Nervous eyes. Tense shoulders. Someone who clearly did not belong here. When the elevator doors opened, a woman in a tailored navy suit greeted me. "This way." She led me through a quiet hallway lined with modern artwork and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Every detail screamed wealth. Not flashy wealth. The kind of wealth that no longer needed to impress anyone. We stopped outside a large office. The assistant opened the door. "Mr. Sterling will see you now." Then she disappeared, leaving me completely alone. I stepped inside. Alexander sat behind a massive desk overlooking Manhattan. Morning sunlight filled the room. Papers rested neatly beside a laptop. A coffee cup sat untouched near his hand. He looked exactly the same as he had the night before. Calm, controlled, impossible to read. I remained near the doorway. "You wanted to see me?" Alexander looked up from the document he was reviewing. "Please sit." His voice was polite. That somehow felt more intimidating than anger. I lowered myself into the chair across from him. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, I gathered enough courage to break the silence. "I know the artifact was valuable." Alexander nodded slightly. "It was. I cannot afford to replace it." "I know." Not reassuring. Not reassuring at all. My hands tightened together. "Then why am I here?" Alexander studied me carefully, the same way someone examines a puzzle they have not solved yet. Then he surprised me. "Do you know what that artifact actually was?" I frowned. "An antique porcelain vase." "Partially correct." He stood and walked toward the window. "It belonged to my grandmother." My chest tightened unexpectedly. Suddenly the situation felt worse. Much worse. Alexander remained facing the skyline. Most people assumed its value came from auctions and collectors. He glanced back at me. They were wrong. For the first time since entering the office, I saw genuine emotion flicker across his face. Gone almost immediately, but real. Then why keep it displayed at a charity event? I asked softly. A faint smile appeared. Brief. Unexpected. "That is an excellent question." He walked back toward the desk, then opened a folder resting beside him. "Miss Bennett, I am not interested in financial compensation." My heart skipped. If he did not want money, what exactly did he want? Alexander slid a document across the desk toward me. "I have something else in mind." And as I looked down at the first page, I realized my life was about to become far more complicated than a broken artifact. I always thought the worst thing Alexander Sterling could do was demand money I did not have. As it turned out, I lacked imagination. The document sat between us on the desk. Thick, professional, dangerous. I stared at the first page while my brain struggled to process what I was reading. Then I looked up at Alexander, then back down, then up again. Surely I had misunderstood something. This cannot be serious. Alexander folded his hands calmly. "It is completely serious." My pulse immediately accelerated. You want me to work for you? He nodded once. Temporarily. I looked back at the contract. Several pages outlined responsibilities, confidentiality agreements, schedules, and conditions. None of it made any sense. Why? The question escaped before I could stop it. Alexander remained silent for a moment. Because I need someone with your specific background. That answer only created 10 new questions. I work in a museum. Exactly. You own an international corporation. Also correct. I stared at him. The conversation felt like a puzzle missing half its pieces. Alexander finally leaned back slightly in his chair. 3 months from now, Sterling Holdings will host a private exhibition celebrating the company's 100th anniversary. I listened carefully. Several historical collections from my family's estate will be displayed publicly for the first time. And the person leading that project resigned last week. Suddenly part of the situation made sense. A very small part. You want me to help organize the exhibition? Yes. I blinked. That is all. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. That is all. The room became very quiet. For the first time since arriving, I felt my shoulders relax slightly. This was unusual. Unexpected. But at least it was not impossible. Why me? I asked again. Alexander looked toward the city outside the windows before answering. Because everyone else sees financial value. His eyes returned to mine. You saw history. The statement caught me completely off guard. Before I could respond, he continued. I reviewed your work after the gala. My heart nearly stopped. You did what? Your published research. Museum projects. Restoration work. I stared at him. You investigated me. I researched a potential employee. Somehow he made it sound perfectly reasonable. I was not convinced. Still, curiosity slowly began replacing fear. The opportunity itself was extraordinary. Most people in my profession would spend years hoping for access to collections like the ones Alexander apparently possessed. Yet another part of me remained suspicious. Nothing about this felt accidental. What happens if I refuse? I asked carefully. Alexander answered immediately. Then you refuse. That surprised me. No consequences. No. No lawsuit. No. No demand for compensation? No. He sounded almost amused now. I narrowed my eyes. Why do I feel like you are not telling me something? Alexander's expression became unreadable again. Because I am not telling you everything. Honest. Frustratingly honest. Before I could press further, he stood and walked toward a cabinet near the window. From inside he removed a small wooden box. Dark walnut. Beautiful craftsmanship. He carried it back and placed it gently on the desk. Open it. I hesitated, then carefully lifted the lid. Inside rested a photograph. An elderly woman smiling beside a younger Alexander. My gaze shifted toward him. Your grandmother? He nodded. The artifact belonged to her. I looked back at the photograph. The woman seemed warm, kind, the type of person who remembered birthdays and baked cookies during holidays. Suddenly the broken porcelain felt far more significant than any auction price. She would not have wanted you to blame yourself forever, Alexander said quietly. I looked up in surprise. For the first time, his voice carried something softer than business, something human. Then he closed the box. Take the contract home. He slid it toward me. Think about it. I stood slowly, still overwhelmed. As I reached the door, Alexander spoke again. One more thing, Miss Bennett. I turned. His expression remained calm. If you accept, your life is going to change. Walking into Sterling Tower that morning had felt terrifying. Walking out somehow felt even worse. Because deep down, I already suspected I was going to say yes. Some doors open so quietly that you do not realize your entire life has changed until weeks later. 3 days after signing the contract, I found myself standing in front of iron gates taller than any building near my Brooklyn apartment. Beyond them stretched acres of perfectly maintained grounds, winding stone paths, fountains, gardens, and a mansion that looked less like a home and more like something preserved from another century. Sterling Manor. I stared through the car window as the gates slowly opened. My pulse immediately accelerated. This was where Alexander Sterling actually lived. Not the version magazines photographed. Not the carefully managed public image. The real place. The real man. The driver parked near the front entrance. Before I could fully process what I was seeing, a member of the household staff greeted me with a warm smile. "Welcome, Miss Bennett." I stepped out carrying a single suitcase and suddenly felt underdressed, underqualified, and entirely out of place. The entrance hall alone was larger than my entire apartment. Sunlight streamed through enormous windows. Marble floors reflected crystal chandeliers overhead. Paintings lined the walls. Antique furniture stood beside modern design elements. The house somehow managed to feel both historic and lived in. I followed the staff member through several hallways before arriving at a guest suite. Calling it a suite felt inaccurate. It was practically an apartment. There was a sitting area, a fireplace, a private balcony, and a bedroom larger than any space I had ever slept in. "If you need anything, please let us know." The door closed behind her. Silence settled over the room. I walked toward the balcony and looked across the property. Somewhere below, gardeners worked among rows of flowers. In the distance, I could see a small lake reflecting the afternoon sun. Everything felt unreal. My phone buzzed. It was Chloe from the museum. The second I answered, she asked, "Are you actually living at a billionaire's estate?" I laughed despite myself. "Temporarily. That is not a denial. It is for work." "Sure it is." I rolled my eyes and looked out across the grounds again. "You watch too many movies. And you accidentally walked into one." The conversation stayed with me long after we hung up. Later that evening, I finally saw Alexander again. He was waiting in the library when I arrived for our first planning meeting. Floor to ceiling. Bookshelves surrounded the room. A fire burned quietly in the stone fireplace. Several documents rested on a large table near the center. Alexander glanced up as I entered. Settling in? As well as someone can when they suddenly start living inside a museum. Something unexpected happened. He smiled. A real smile. Brief but genuine. The transformation was startling. For a moment he looked less like a billionaire CEO and more like a normal person. Then the expression disappeared. "Come with me," he said. Curious, I followed him through a side corridor and down a staircase. Eventually we stopped outside a locked wooden door. Alexander opened it carefully. The room beyond took my breath away. Display cases filled the space. Historical documents. Artwork. Rare artifacts. Family heirlooms. Decades of history preserved with extraordinary care. My eyes moved slowly across the collection. Then I noticed an empty pedestal near the center of the room. The missing artifact. The broken one. Alexander followed my gaze. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he surprised me again. "My grandmother used to say that objects are only valuable because of the stories attached to them." His voice softened slightly. "The story is still here." I looked at him. Really looked at him. And for the first time since the gala, I began to suspect that Alexander Sterling was hiding far more than a private collection. The truth about valuable things is that their worth rarely comes from money. Comes from memory. Over the next 2 weeks, Sterling Manor slowly became less intimidating. Not normal. Never normal. But familiar. My days filled with cataloging family collections, reviewing archives, and preparing exhibition plans. Every morning, I worked inside the private gallery hidden beneath the mansion. Every evening, I returned to my suite carrying pages of notes and a dozen new questions. Most of those questions involved Alexander Sterling. The more I learned about his family's collection, the less I understood the man himself. Publicly, he was known as one of the most disciplined executives in the country. Privately, he preserved handwritten letters, childhood sketches, travel journals, and tiny family keepsakes with almost obsessive care. The contrast fascinated me. One rainy afternoon, I found myself alone in the archive room organizing documents from the 1950s. Thunder rolled softly outside. Rain tapped against the windows. I reached for a leather-bound journal resting on a nearby shelf. According to the label, it belonged to Alexander's grandmother. Curiosity won immediately. Carefully opening the journal, I discovered page after page of handwritten entries. Family stories. Personal reflections. Travel memories. Then one passage caught my attention. I sat down and read it twice. Alexander is convinced strength means carrying everything alone. One day he will learn that true strength is allowing people to stand beside him. I stared at the words. The entry had been written nearly 20 years earlier. Somehow it described him perfectly. She always said things like that. I nearly jumped out of my chair. Alexander stood in the doorway holding 2 coffee cups. I had been so focused on reading that I never heard him enter. You scared me. A faint smile appeared. I am beginning to hear that often. He handed me a cup before glancing toward the journal. She wrote every day. I looked down at the pages again. She seems remarkable. Something softened in his expression. She was. The room grew quiet. Outside, rain continued falling against the glass. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I asked the question that had been bothering me for weeks. Why was the vase so important? Alexander stared into his coffee, not avoiding the question, choosing his answer carefully. When I was 12, my parents died in a plane accident. My breath caught. He rarely spoke about himself. Never like this. I am sorry. He nodded slightly. My grandmother raised me after that. His eyes drifted toward the journal resting on the table. The vase sat in her living room for as long as I can remember. Suddenly everything made sense. The artifact had never been about wealth. It had been about home, family, the last connection to someone he loved. You should have been furious with me. The words escaped before I could stop them. Alexander looked directly at me. I was not. Why? For several seconds he said nothing. Then he surprised me again. Because when it broke, you looked more upset than I felt. I blinked. That is not possible. It is. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. You were convinced your life was over. Embarrassment immediately warmed my face. Unfortunately, he was not wrong. Alexander took another sip of coffee. My grandmother cared about people more than objects. His gaze settled on the journal. She would have been far more interested in the person who broke the vase than the vase itself. Silence settled between us. Comfortable silence. The kind that feels surprisingly easy. Then a phone buzzed. Alexander glanced at the screen. Whatever message he received instantly erased the warmth from his expression. His posture stiffened. The billionaire CEO returned. What happened? I asked. Alexander locked the screen. Apparently half of New York now believes we are secretly engaged. My coffee nearly slipped from my hands. There are moments when life becomes so absurd that laughing feels more reasonable than panicking. This was one of those moments. Secretly engaged? I repeated. Alexander placed his phone on the table and rubbed the bridge of his nose. The gesture somehow made him seem more human than any conversation we had shared so far. Unfortunately. I stared at him. How does an entire city accidentally decide 2 people are engaged? He gave me a look that suggested I was underestimating the creativity of the media. Then he turned the screen toward me. My jaw nearly hit the floor. There we were. Photographs from the gala. Photographs of us entering Sterling Tower. Photographs of us walking through Manhattan after a planning meeting. Headlines stretched across multiple entertainment websites. Billionaire CEO finally finds mystery woman. Sources hint at engagement. Sterling heir preparing for marriage. I looked up in disbelief. This is insane. I agree. None of this is true. Also correct. I continued scrolling. Apparently anonymous sources had already created an entire fictional relationship. According to one article, we had been dating for months. Another claimed I was moving into Sterling Manor because of wedding preparations. One particularly creative reporter insisted a private ceremony had already occurred somewhere in Europe. I have never even been to Europe, I muttered. Alexander almost smiled. Almost. The problem is not the stories themselves. My attention immediately shifted back to him. Then what is the problem? His expression became serious. My grandfather. Of all the answers I expected, that was not one of them. Your grandfather? Alexander nodded. He is 87 years old. He adores family traditions. A sinking feeling immediately formed in my stomach. And he called 30 minutes ago to congratulate me. I covered my face with both hands. Oh no. That was essentially my reaction. The room fell silent. Rain continued tapping against the windows. Somewhere deep inside Sterling Manor, a grandfather apparently believed wedding bells were approaching. Eventually I lowered my hands. You can explain the truth. Alexander leaned back in his chair. I tried. And he invited us to a family gathering this weekend. I stared at him. Us. My brain immediately recognized danger. Absolutely not. Olivia. No. Hear me out. Those 3 words never lead anywhere good. I crossed my arms. I am listening. Alexander stood and slowly walked toward the window. The city skyline remained hidden behind gray clouds. The anniversary exhibition depends heavily on family donors. I narrowed my eyes. That sounds suspiciously like a business problem. It is partially a business problem. Partially. He sighed. And partially a family problem. Somehow that answer felt worse. I waited. Alexander turned toward me again. If I publicly deny everything right now, the media attention increases. That seems backwards. Welcome to modern journalism. Unfortunately, he had a point. I hated that he had a point. He continued. If we simply attend the gathering together and allow the rumors to settle naturally, the situation disappears within a few weeks. I blinked. Then blinked again. You want me to pretend to be your fiancé? Silence. Alexander said nothing, which was answer enough. Stood up so quickly my chair nearly tipped backward. Absolutely not. This time he actually smiled. A real one. Brief but unmistakable. That is exactly what I expected you to say. Good. However, I immediately hated that word. Alexander reached into a folder resting on the table. Then he handed me a newspaper clipping. The headline featured a photograph of his grandmother standing beside a much younger version of his grandfather. My confusion deepened. What does this have to do with anything? Alexander's expression softened unexpectedly. Their anniversary would have been next month. I looked down at the photograph, then back at him. Suddenly the situation felt far more complicated than a ridiculous rumor. And somehow, I suspected Alexander Sterling had not yet revealed the most important part of his plan. The most dangerous thing about pretending is how easily it begins to feel real. I agreed to attend the family gathering 3 days later. Not because Alexander convinced me with business arguments. Not because of media rumors. And certainly not because I wanted to pretend to be engaged to a billionaire. I agreed because of the photograph. The one showing his grandparents smiling at each other as if the rest of the world did not exist. Something about it stayed with me. Maybe because genuine happiness is difficult to fake. The gathering took place at a lakeside estate owned by the Sterling family several hours outside Manhattan. The property looked like something from another era. Rolling green hills stretched toward the water. White stone pathways wound through gardens filled with late summer flowers. Family members and guests filled the grounds. Laughter drifted through the air. Music played softly somewhere in the distance. As our car approached the entrance, I suddenly became aware of how ridiculous the situation was. I still cannot believe I agreed to this. Alexander glanced over from the driver's seat. Neither can I. I looked at him suspiciously. That is not reassuring. To my surprise, he laughed. Not a polite smile. Not a brief amusement. A genuine laugh. The sound caught me completely off guard. Over the past month I had seen glimpses of different versions of Alexander Sterling. The billionaire. Theo. The grandson. The collector. Yet this version felt entirely new. Relaxed. Human. We stepped from the car together. Almost immediately, an elderly man began walking toward us across the lawn. Even before Alexander spoke, I knew exactly who he was. The resemblance was unmistakable. Grandfather. The older man's face brightened instantly. Then his attention shifted to me. You must be Olivia. Before I could answer, he pulled me into a warm hug. I froze in surprise, then slowly returned it. It is wonderful to finally meet you, he said. I glanced toward Alexander. He looked mildly horrified. The sight almost made me laugh. For the next several hours I was introduced to cousins, aunts, uncles, and family friends. Everyone already seemed convinced I belonged there. At first, I expected Alexander to maintain emotional distance. Instead, He remained beside me throughout the afternoon. When conversations became overwhelming, he quietly redirected attention elsewhere. When I looked lost, he explained family stories. When distant relatives asked uncomfortable questions, he somehow managed to answer them without actually revealing anything. Felt strangely natural, as though we had been doing this for years. Later that evening, I escaped briefly to a quiet dock overlooking the lake. The sunset painted the water gold. Gentle waves moved against the wooden posts. For the first time all day I was alone. Or so I thought. Hiding. Alexander's voice came from behind me. I smiled without turning. Recovering. He stepped beside me. Together we watched the sunset in comfortable silence. Eventually I glanced toward him. Your family is wonderful. His expression softened. They liked you. That sounds dangerous. A faint smile appeared. Possibly. The breeze carried the scent of water and summer flowers. Somewhere behind us, distant laughter echoed across the estate. For several moments neither of us spoke. Then I noticed something unusual. Alexander looked happier here than anywhere else. Not powerful. Not successful. Simply happy. You are different around them, I said quietly. He stared out at the lake. They knew me before I became who everyone expects me to be. The honesty in his voice surprised me. Slowly, I began to understand the loneliness hidden beneath his polished public image. The world saw a billionaire. His family saw a grandson. Somehow I was beginning to see both. Then his phone buzzed. The moment he checked the screen, the warmth vanished from his expression. I immediately recognized the change. The CEO had returned. Alexander locked the phone and looked toward the horizon. We have a problem. My stomach tightened. What kind of problem? His gaze met mine. Calm. Serious. Someone just leaked engagement photographs to every major media outlet in the country. The truth has a way of appearing when you least expect it. By the time we returned to Sterling Manor that evening, every major business publication and entertainment website seemed determined to tell the story of a romance that did not actually exist. Photographs of Alexander and me standing beside the lake had spread everywhere. Headlines speculated about wedding dates. Commentators analyzed body language. Complete strangers debated our future, as though they had been invited into our lives. I sat in the library staring at a tablet screen while Alexander spoke with his communications team in the next room. Even through the closed door, I could hear the controlled tension in his voice. Not anger. Precision. The kind of focus that built corporations. An hour later, he finally entered the library. His tie was gone. His sleeves were rolled up. He looked tired for the first time since I had met him. How bad is it? I asked. Alexander sat across from me and exhaled slowly. Worse than expected. I winced. That sounds encouraging. A faint smile appeared. I am trying to remain optimistic. Silence settled between us. The fire crackled softly nearby. Outside, darkness had fallen across the estate. Eventually I lowered the tablet. There is something I do not understand. Alexander looked at me. Only one thing? I ignored that. Why are you really keeping me here? The question hung in the air. For weeks I had sensed there was more to this arrangement than an exhibition. More than media rumors. More than family expectations. Alexander became very still. For a moment I thought he might avoid the question. Instead he surprised me. Because you changed something. I frowned. By breaking a vase? Not the vase. His gaze remained steady. Me. I blinked. That was not remotely the answer I expected. Alexander looked toward the fire before continuing. After my parents died, my grandmother spent years teaching me that people mattered more than achievements. His voice remained calm. When she passed away, I buried myself in work. I listened quietly. It was easier that way. He smiled without humor. Companies are simpler than relationships. Something about the honesty in his voice made my chest tighten. Alexander continued. Then you broke the artifact. I groaned softly. I am never escaping that moment. Probably not. To my surprise, he looked amused. Then his expression softened. Everyone else focused on the value of the object. You focused on what it meant. I thought back to the photograph. The journal. His grandmother's stories. That does not explain why I am here. No. He leaned forward slightly. It explains why I noticed you. The room suddenly felt much quieter. My pulse became uncomfortably aware of itself. Alexander rarely spoke emotionally. When he did, every word carried weight. For the first time in years, he said quietly, someone looked at my family history instead of my net worth. I stared at him, completely speechless. He laughed softly. You are unusually quiet. I am trying to process that sentence. The corner of his mouth lifted. Then the smile faded. Olivia, the exhibition was real. The contract was real. Everything about the project was real. My heart accelerated. But Alexander looked directly into my eyes. I could have hired dozens of qualified people. The implication settled between us. Slow. Unavoidable. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, I looked away first. Outside the windows, the estate lights glowed against the darkness. Somewhere in the distance, water reflected moonlight. Everything felt strangely fragile. Then Alexander stood and walked toward a cabinet near the fireplace. From inside, he removed a small velvet box. My stomach immediately dropped. Every alarming possibility rushed through my mind at once. He carried the box back toward me and placed it gently on the table. Before you panic, he said, this is not what you think. Which, unfortunately, was exactly the kind of sentence that guaranteed panic. Then he opened the box. And inside was something that changed everything. Some treasures survive because they are protected. Others survive because they are finally understood. I stared at the velvet box resting on the table between us. Inside was not a ring. Not a family heirloom. Not anything remotely connected to marriage. Instead, carefully protected beneath the soft lining, rested several restored porcelain fragments. My breath caught immediately. I recognized them at once. They were pieces of the broken artifact. You kept them, I whispered. Alexander looked at the fragments before answering. Of course I did. My eyes remained fixed on the box. Weeks earlier, those shattered pieces had felt like the end of my world. Now they looked different. Smaller somehow. Less frightening. I thought they were destroyed. Some were. His voice softened. Not all of them. Carefully, he lifted one fragment and turned it in the light. Delicate blue patterns still decorated the surface. My grandmother used to believe broken things could still have meaning. He smiled faintly. She would probably be disappointed if I threw them away. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Then I noticed something beneath the fragments. A folded piece of paper. Alexander removed it carefully and handed it to me. My fingers trembled slightly as I unfolded it. The handwriting was elegant and unmistakably old. It is from my grandmother, Alexander said quietly. I began reading. The letter was short, simple, beautiful. Spoke about family, about second chances, about how unexpected people often arrive exactly when they are needed most. By the time I reached the final sentence, my vision had blurred. Sometimes the most valuable gift is not what a person brings into your life. It is what they help you remember about yourself. I lowered the letter slowly. Silence filled the library. The fire continued crackling softly nearby. Outside, the estate slept beneath the night sky. She wrote that years ago? I asked. Alexander nodded. A long time ago. His gaze settled on me. But every time I read it, I think about you. My heart forgot how to beat properly. The room suddenly felt very small. Very quiet. Very real. Alexander stood and walked toward the window. For a moment, I thought he was gathering his thoughts. Then he turned back toward me. No Billionaire mask. No sé o que poucher. Just honesty. Olivia, when you first walked into my life, I thought you were a complication. A reluctant smile touched my lips. That sounds romantic. He laughed softly. Let me finish. I nodded. His expression became serious again. Then I thought you were a solution to a problem. His eyes never left mine. I was wrong both times. Emotion tightened inside my chest. Alexander took a slow breath. You became the person who reminded me who I was before the world started measuring everything by success. The words settled between us. Warm. Unshakable. True. For once I could not find a response. I did not need one. Alexander stepped closer. Not dramatically. Not hurriedly. Simply enough to close the distance that had existed between us for so long. The exhibition will end. His voice remained calm. The media attention will disappear. He smiled slightly. Even my grandfather will eventually stop planning imaginary weddings. I laughed through unexpected tears. Then his expression softened completely. But I would like one thing to remain. My pulse raced. What? For the first time since the gala, since the broken artifact, since every impossible event that followed, Alexander Sterling looked uncertain. Us. The single word changed everything. I looked at the restored fragments. At the letter. At the man standing in front of me. Then I smiled. Somewhere along the way, a broken treasure had led me to something infinitely more valuable. And for the first time, our future was not an accident. It was a choice.